Today I'm going to share with you 12 settings you need to set to save your brass or sanity in Photoshop. So without any further ado, let's get started. If you're secretly rich and you're inviting Taylor Swift to your birthday party and you're designing posters for it for your elite guest, you don't want Adobe researchers to see that. So all you need to do is to go to Photoshop, settings, inside of that, product improvement. If you're using a Windows, edit, preferences, inside of that, product improvement. And just make sure that you uncheck, yes, I'd like to participate. Uncheck that so that Adobe researchers won't be able to collect image data that will be viewed by researchers or all of this stuff. This is also very useful if you're working on a top secret NDA project and you don't want anyone else to see. Hit OK once you're happy with it, and just to be sure, restart Photoshop. If I were to just dab 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? We can always go back by pressing Ctrl or Command Z or Z, however you pronounce it, wherever you are. But if you were to continue undoing, at some point, it won't be able to undo. In this case, after 5 times, I'm stuck. I cannot go back any further. I can redo, of course, but I cannot just go back any further. And why do you think this is happening? Because the amount of history states Photoshop is set to remember. In my case, it is just 5, and by default, it is 50. So if we were to go to the history panel right here, as you can see, it is just only holding 5 instances. So as I continue to paint, it is not remembering anything beyond 5. So here's how to fix it. Go to Photoshop, Settings, and then Performance. On Windows again, Edit Preferences. As you can see, my history states is set to an incredibly low, unacceptable number of 5. By default, it should be 50 for you. But the good news is, you can even increase it up to 1,000. That is fantastic, but be careful with it. It may affect performance if you don't have a powerful enough computer. I recommend testing with 1,000. If everything works for you smoothly, go for it. I usually leave it at that, hit OK, and now it would remember up to 1,000 steps. So even if I continue painting, it will remember it all. If I press Ctrl or Command Z, beyond 5, of course. Now I'm not going to do 1,000 strokes, but you get the point. Now this one is a big deal in retouching, or actually whatever you do in Photoshop that involves zooming and moving around. Let's say you are dodging and burning. You're zoomed in, you're painting white and black, and now you want to move around. And here's the problem. If you hold the spacebar, the hand tool shows up, everybody knows that, and now you can move around. That is good. But if you hold the spacebar, you move around and you let go, it keeps moving, and that is an issue. Let's zoom in even more. You're holding the spacebar and then you move around and you let go. It keeps on moving and it can be distracting for you. See, it just is like it continues to move. That is just crazy, and it can be very distracting while you're retouching. So for it, I recommend going to Photoshop settings, go to the tools section, and then just turn off enable flick panning. This will save you a ton of sanity, especially while retouching. However, if you like to work that way, that is fine too. Hit OK. And now when you hold the spacebar, move around and you let go, it stops right there. Move around, let go, it stops right there. Stops right there. Stops right there. So it takes away the naggingness from navigation. Imagine you're working on a big Photoshop project for 3 hours and suddenly out of the blue Photoshop crashes. What do? Option A, bang your head on the wall. Option B, pull your hair out. Or option C, just give up and watch TV. Well, let's go with option D. Let us prevent all of that. In Photoshop, say you have worked really hard to create a composite. So many layers, so many masks, so many just brush strokes. So you need to prevent that. Step number 1. Go to Photoshop settings, inside of that, file handling. And you want to make sure auto save right here or saving recovery information is turned on. It has to be turned on. And it gives you the option to decide at what duration you want to keep saving your project. I save it to the least amount of duration, that is 5 minutes. In every 5 minutes, it's going to keep saving your progress. So in the worst case scenario, you only lose 5 minutes worth of work. But even that is not enough. Please understand this. Sometimes even autosave has failed for me. Maybe it won't happen in the future, but just to be sure, please develop the habit of pressing Ctrl or Command S like muscle memory every once in a while as you're working through your project. Anytime you make even a little change in your project, like moving this curve right here, it will show an asterisk, which means your progress has not been saved. If you press Ctrl or Command S, it is saved right now, and the asterisk after saving goes away. So set the autosave right and have the habit of pressing Ctrl or Command S like muscle memory. So after working with a lot of layers, let's say your Photoshop is starting to choke up or slow down. Maybe you've not assigned enough RAM to it. So here's how to set it up. Back in Photoshop settings, go to performance right here. This slider lets you decide how much RAM you want to let Photoshop use, or in other words, how much RAM do you assign to Photoshop? So let's say your computer has 192 GB of RAM. Out of that, how much of that do you assign to Photoshop? So find a sweet spot that works for you. If it's too low and your Photoshop is acting up, you may want to increase that. Also, if you have a graphics card in your computer, you must check Use Graphic Processor for a much better performance. Sometimes some issues can occur in Photoshop, and for those little scenarios, you may want to uncheck that. But apart from that, keep it checked. And whenever you make changes to any of these settings, although it doesn't explicitly say that for many of those settings, just restart Photoshop to be sure. Alright, so this has been a big problem that a lot of people face. You're working on your document and suddenly this error shows up. Even if you haven't faced it yet, you don't want to face it in the future. And that is scratch disks full. Here's how to fix it. As you continue to work on your document, Photoshop starts to save some temporary data and files in the background. And when this data completely fills up your storage, you get this error. To prevent this from happening and for a smoother experience, you want to go to Settings and Scratch Disks. And here you can see which drives have you assigned to store all that temporary data. By default, my computer's main storage is checked and it has more than enough space. If you're running out of space, you can check more drives or install new ones. Or you can just keep one of the drives you have added or installed as Scratch Disk. That is up to you. I'm going to set it to the way it was, but if you're running out of space, you can check multiple ones as well. And hit OK, and again, restart Photoshop. Now your images can look terrible if you don't do this. Have a look at it. So let's say here's the editing you have done. And if you were to create a stamp visible layer at the top by pressing Ctrl, Alt, Shift, and E, this is a merged layer, right? And usually we right click on it and convert it into a smart object. Now here's the issue. If you go to image size, no matter what resampling you choose right here, let's reduce the size to around 400 pixels width. Hit OK. Have a look at the pixely sparkle right here. Why is that happening? Why is this so harsh? It is all due to the wrong interpolation. This is how it works. Just go to the general settings of Photoshop. Shortcut is Command K or Control K. Inside of that, image interpolation is the culprit. You can decide what works for you for your project. You can do your research. I usually set it to bicubic automatic. It works for me for most of the cases. Hit OK. And now it's best to restart Photoshop, but I think it should be working once we press Control or Command T again and just hit Enter. See? All of those sparkliness goes away. So set the image interpolation right if you don't want to pull your hair. Keep in mind, these interpolation settings affect everything. Even if you have not resized the whole image, even if you just press Ctrl or Command T and resized it and your interpolation is wrong, this element right here may look too sparkly or too blurry depending upon the image interpolation setting that you have chosen. How often have you just opened Photoshop to notice that the icons and the menu and everything inside of the UI is just so small that you may need a magnifying glass to work with it? And it usually happens with high resolution displays. It may look something like this. Mine is scaled for educational videos, so it is a bit big, but to set it up for yourself, go to Photoshop, Settings, Interface, and right in here you can set the UI font size to small, medium, tiny, large. So I set it to large, it works for me, and you can also check Scale UI to Font. That way if you set it to large, everything will be nice, big, and clean, if that's what you want. I usually set it to large, it just is much more convenient for me. Hit OK and then restart Photoshop for the changes to take effect. Now sometimes when you're working with a brush, you may feel like you don't have enough control. It's not exactly moving as you want it to move and there's a bit of lag. The reason why that is happening is because the smoothing by default is set to 10%. For the most part of Photoshop, I recommend setting this to 0 so that the brush becomes very responsive. The higher the smoothing, the more delay there will be and the more smoother it will be. For example, see how much delayed this one is, but also it's very, very smooth. So when you want to create smoother lines, you can turn it up, and for the rest of the times, I recommend keeping it 0, unless you have a specific use case. Speaking of tools, sometimes your tool may not work properly. Of course, the tools in Photoshop, let's say you want to remove this thing right here with the patch tool. And I've had this issue while teaching a workshop. Somebody tried to remove it like so, and it just looks odd. Why is it looking like that? The patch tool is much better than this, isn't it? The problem is the patch is set to content aware. We need to set it to normal to work better in most cases. So now let's go back. Now when you try to do this again, it does give you a much better result. Now, of course, you can select this area and improve that. That is another discussion. But the point is, you need to set the tools right. And sometimes when you're new to Photoshop, you may not know what the defaults are and you accidentally might bump something up. So to reset any tool, just click on this arrow right next to the tool at the top, click on the gear right here and simply click on Reset Tool. everything would be reset to defaults. So even if you have changed it to content aware, destination, not destination, structure, color, everything is changed right here. If I click on this arrow right here at the top, next to any tool, click on this gear, click on reset tool, it's all reset to its default settings. We all adore the quick selection tool, but it has a big problem if you don't turn this on. So let's say you were selecting this bowl with the quick selection tool right here, and let us do that. Fantastic so far, isn't it? Now, with this selection active, click on the mask button. Here we have it masked out, and here we have a black background. Let's zoom in, have a look at the edge. It is so bumpy up and down. And this is actually the default settings for the tool. Now, instead of doing that, let us check Enhance Edge at the top. And now when you make a selection, it may be a bit slower when you're doing that. However, once it's done, let's click on the mask button again, and now have a look. It's so much better than before. Just for a comparison, I created 2 history states for it. Here is one with Enhance Edge, as you can see, and here is one without it. You can see the difference right here. So, with, without. Also, anytime you see anti-aliasing in Photoshop, you turn that on for most of the cases for smoother edges. Unless, of course, you have a specific use case. For example, with the Magic Wand tool, at the top you have anti-aliasing. You want to make sure this is turned on. If it's turned off, let's say you made a selection of this. Let's mask it out by clicking on this button and have a look at this. It will have all of these hard edges. See? But with anti-aliasing turned on, let's go back. Turn on anti-aliasing, make the same selection, and again create the mask. And now have a look. It is so much smoother than before. This also applies to text, by the way. I usually get a lot of questions about when I type the text. The edges are just so harsh, as you can see like this. Just select the text tool. You can select the text too. And at the top, you want to make sure in the drop down, it is set to sharp. That will introduce some anti-aliasing, and now it is so much better. So here's the before, as you can see, so bad. Here is the after. Gets so much more smoother. Now this can be a blessing, this can be a curse, but you have to decide what really works for you. So I was designing this thumbnail, and let's say we wanted to add some text to it. Say we made it bigger. Now here is the issue. As I move it around, it starts snapping to different things, which can be a good thing, but sometimes it can be annoying. For example, I want to keep it right here, but I just cannot keep it because it's snapping to all those areas. It's not letting me smoothly move this. So how do we stop all of this snapping? Simply go to View, and you want to make sure Snap is unchecked. Once that is unchecked, it moves smoothly. But what about the times when we do need snapping? Go to View again and turn on snapping. Notice that there is a shortcut for it too, and that is Command-Shift:. Now the snapping is off, Command-Shift:, and now the snapping is on. Easy. Last but not the least, be careful with Photoshop Beta. Know that you're playing with snakes when you're working with Photoshop Beta. It's great if you want to try out new features, if you want to experiment with your photos, but if you're working on your client projects, please work on the regular version of Photoshop, because in the beta, they're testing out new features and it can crash at any time. Be careful with Photoshop Beta. If you're not at all interested in testing out new features, don't even install it. You should be fine. So that's all for this video. I hope these settings set you for a less frustrative Photoshop, if that's a word. And if this video helped you, make sure to give us a like, and also don't forget to subscribe, and not just subscribe. Ring the bell so that you, my friend, don't miss any other feature tips, tricks, or tutorials. I would like to take this moment to thank all of these nice and incredible people for supporting PiXimperfect on Patreon and making videos like this possible. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in my next one. Till then, stay tuned and make sure that you keep creating.